As the rules of primogeniture have explicitly favoured male succession since the Middle Ages, Britain has always had far more ruling kings than queens, which is like most other cultures. The system wasn't changed until 2013. Ironically, the first royal baby born under this new regime was male, so we'll actually have 3 kings in a row after the Queen pops the clogs. While it's true that many queen consorts have exercised considerable secular, spiritual and even military authority, I thought it would be an interesting exercise to focus only on queens who are rulers in their own right, and give a quick sketch of the kind of lives they led. The technical term for this is queen regnant as opposed to queen regent, regents being monarch spouses who rule in their absence temporarily. I'll be including a few that aren't traditionally counted as their rules were disputed or they were never formally crowned, but who are rarely talked about. I briefly mentioned some well-known warrior queens from pre-Roman Britain, though it's more accurate to call these tribal leaders rather than queens in the meaningful sense. I think the most notable of these are obviously Boudica and Cartimandua. They were both kind of badass warrior queen type characters who tried to resist the Romans by rallying neighbouring tribes to fight them, but of course were ultimately defeated, as was everyone else. There's no shame in that, it was the Romans we're talking about. Boudica in particular is quite a well-known figure. Interest in her was actually revived during Victorian times, where her brave but ultimately doomed and tragic resistance took on nationalist overtones, and she became a kind of almost a national symbol, almost in the same way that Britannia is. There's a kind of irony that a figure who so bravely resisted foreign oppression would be a national symbol of an imperial power, but that's by the by. But as I say, that's obviously worth mentioning them. We're talking really about tribes rather than kingdoms at this stage, so we're going to move forward in history a little bit to Anglo-Saxon times. Now, I won't go into great detail about the political situation, but following the Roman withdrawal, Britain and Ireland are made up of a patchwork of small kingdoms. England in particular is made up of 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which is often called the Heptarchy. This period is somewhat bewildering to those unfamiliar with it. The political geography and even the names and spelling are quite disorientating for anyone who's unfamiliar with the period. So I will mention a couple of names of small kingdoms, but don't be baffled by that. Now, a couple of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms did have ruling queens. Most notably would be Ethelflaed in Mercia. Now, she was the daughter of Alfred the Great, obviously the King of Wessex, who managed to resist falling to the Vikings where all the other English kingdoms had been defeated. Ethelflaed ruled for around 7 years. She actually achieved quite a lot. Most famously, she recaptured Derby and Leicester from the Vikings. Now, this was part of the ongoing Anglo-Saxon reconquest of much of England from the Vikings. At one point, the Danelaw had covered all of England except for the West Country, but Wessex had slowly rolled back the tide, and the Anglo-Saxons were slowly retaking England, and at the same time going through a process of amalgamation to form what would ultimately become England. And Ethelflaed's conquests were actually an important part of this. And she was followed by her daughter, Alfred of Mercia, although she only ruled for a few months. Another possible candidate would be Ceaxbur of Wessex. We know very little about her, but she supposedly ruled Wessex for around a year following her husband's death. Moving on, the first modern kingdom we come to is Ireland. I'm not aware of any ruling queens of Ireland prior to the Norman conquests. There are almost certainly no high queens. One is mentioned in some annals, but she's almost certainly fictitious. Similarly, Queen Maeve of Connacht is another mythological figure, who was concerned primarily with high-stakes cattle rustling and light-hearted debauchery. Popular piratical figure Grace O'Malley only ruled Umhail, which is at best a sub-kingdom of Connacht, so I don't count it for my purposes. The Norman invasion of 1169 established the Lordship of Ireland, which was under the English crown, until 1542, when Ireland is upgraded again to a kingdom, but is still a possession of the English crown. Ireland is therefore included by virtue of several English queens also being Queens of Ireland as well, and later as part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Though Ireland today, of course, is a republic, with only Northern Ireland remaining as part of the United Kingdom. We'll move on now then to what was then called the Kingdom of England, but also included Wales. Now, of course, there are several Queen Regents that we can mention, including Ellen of Aquitaine, Isabella of France, Catherine of Aragon and Catherine Parr, the latter of which were both Henry VIII's wives, were all English consorts who acted as Queen Regents, for example ruling while their husbands were away on crusade, or in the sample of Henry VIII wrestling the King of France in a tent. However, the first Queen Regnant we come across would be Matilda, Lady of the English. If you look back a short way on her CV, she was previously Empress Matilda of the Holy Roman Empire. However, after her husband died, she lost this title. Now, following the death of his son in the White Ship disaster, King Henry I nominated Matilda as his heir to avoid a succession crisis. In order to ensure a smooth transition, he had his court take oaths of loyalty to her, but following his death the barons went back on their word, and the throne was usurped by her cousin Stephen, who was one of those who had taken an oath of loyalty. This precipitated a civil war known as the Anarchy. It was a kind of Trump versus Clinton of its day, in the sense that it lasted 19 years. Matilda tried to take the kingdom back by force with the support of her uncle King David I of Scotland and her half-brother Robert, Duke of Gloucester. She ultimately defeated and captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. However, when she tried to enter London, resistance from a huge mob of irritable cockneys prevented her from reaching Westminster Abbey to be formally crowned. For this reason she's rarely thought of as England's first ruling queen. Now Stephen's wife, who is confusingly also called Matilda, dispatched a military force to capture Duke Robert and succeeds during the so-called Rout of Winchester. There's then a hostage exchange in which Stephen is released in exchange for Robert's freedom. Things continue to go south and Matilda finds herself besieged in Oxford Castle, but she ultimately manages to escape across the frozen River Thames. Legend has it she disguised herself in a white dress for camouflage in the snow, which I think is a brilliant touch, and she's ultimately able to get away. Then something of a stalemate develops, with Matilda controlling the West Country and Stephen the South East and the Midlands. Matilda returns to her husband's lands in Normandy. However, she's ultimately victorious in the sense that their son Henry II finishes her work and takes the crown to become King Henry II of England. The next queen on the list, like Matilda, is also perhaps unfairly not considered England's first ruling queen. Lady Jane Grey was queen of both England and Ireland for 9 days. You've almost certainly never heard of a Queen Jane, so I'll give you some brief context. Now in his will, King Henry VIII declared that in what he presumably thought was an extremely unlikely scenario, that should both of his 2 daughters fail to produce heirs, that the throne should pass to the descendants of King Henry's younger sister, which included Lady Jane. Now Henry VIII of course was succeeded by King Edward V, his only son. However, he was on his deathbed by the age of 15 and had no heirs. As a devout Protestant, Edward wished to prevent his Catholic sister Mary from taking the throne and rolling back his Protestant reforms as well as those of his father. His sister Elizabeth, of course, was a Protestant. Regardless, his advisor claimed that he would have to disinherit both his sisters, legally speaking. He therefore named Lady Jane his heir. Following Edward's death, Lady Jane was immediately declared Queen of England and Ireland. She entered London and took up residence in the Tower of London. That may sound like a bad idea, but that was traditional at that time for a monarch waiting to be crowned. However, Parliament declared her to be a usurper and supported Mary's claim to the throne instead. Mary took control of the country, and Jane Grey was charged with high treason. She was initially to be spared. However, a Protestant uprising against Mary's proposed marriage to King Philip II of Spain, and thereby ensure Catholic succession, ensured her execution, although she had nothing to do with it. She was only 16 or 17 at the time. Lady Jane Grey was brought up to become a devout Protestant. She was also relatively well educated for the time, particularly for a woman, having learned Latin, Italian, Greek and Hebrew. The fact that we don't call her Queen Jane, I think, is rather unfair. I've obviously given away our next queen. The first widely accepted Queen Regnant of England was Queen Mary. For reasons we just went into, I don't care much for Mary and I never have. She was rather spoilt as a child by Henry VIII and spent a lot of time gambling with cards. Mary spent most of her reign desperate to produce a Catholic heir, but she was 37 when she took the throne, which was ancient for the time. She suffered a number of false pregnancies, the last of which was probably uterine cancer and ultimately killed her. The public was deeply unhappy with her marriage to King Philip II of Spain, and the court feared that England would be dominated by a foreign Catholic power. Fear of the Spanish Inquisition, which had returned to Spain during this period, probably seemed justified by Mary's brutal suppression of Protestantism in England, which inflamed huge religious tensions. She repealed much of Henry VIII's religious reforms and burned at least 300 Protestants at the stake for heresy. For this reason she's often known as Bloody Mary. She also managed to lose Calais, the last vestige of English control in France. Revisionist historians have tried to move away from the Protestant sectarian lens that we often view Mary through. However, tellingly, they tend to view her as simply less bad, rather than as being anything approaching an effective ruler. When informed of her death, her husband, Philip of Spain, was quoted as saying, "I felt a reasonable regret for her death." Now Mary, of course, was succeeded by her sister Elizabeth I, who you will have heard of, and is one of the greatest British monarchs we've had, probably top 5 at least. Now good Queen Bess managed to avoid being executed by her sister long enough to take the throne. However, almost immediately, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull that declared her rule illegitimate and threatened excommunication for anyone who obeyed her commands. which established an unstable rule and necessitated her to establish a network of spies, which was the precursor to our modern Secret Service. She's most famous, of course, for the defeat of the Spanish Armada, though as we know this could be more accurately characterised as a few dandies taking potshots at a Spanish fleet which ultimately got lost and blew its no-claims bonus by crashing into Ireland. Queen Elizabeth's court was filled by legendary figures such as Shakespeare and Sir Francis Drake. She was also a good mate of Walter Raleigh, who named the English colony of Virginia after her. Interestingly, she also had a peculiar relationship with the Russian Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, who sent her a number of letters. She was preoccupied by trade arrangements, whereas he was keen to establish a military alliance. It's alleged that he may have even proposed to her at some point, although she obviously turned him down. The Virgin Queen was extremely astute in terms of creating an image of herself that in many ways transcended traditional views of rulership, a kind of early cult of personality. This was particularly striking in the way her claimed virginity was used to make her a symbol of purity. She presented herself as almost in a kind of marriage to the nation itself. In this sense she made a virtue of her femininity, at a time when ruling queens were extremely unusual. Her femininity became part of the spectacle of royal majesty. For example, her maids would always dress so as to complement the queen. They would always dress very simply in comparison, while the queen herself would be resplendent, wearing bright colours and draped in jewels. To maintain this image, these same ladies-in-waiting spent up to 4 hours a day dressing and undressing the queen. Our image of Elizabeth has survived through the ages and become a sort of romantic nationalist figure, resurfacing most notably during the Napoleonic Wars. The way she supposedly made a virtue of having the weak body of a woman, standing alone as a symbol of resistance against foreign invasion. Similarly, she bought into the ideas of the body politique and presented herself as both king and queen to the people. As well as using the pure ideal of virginity, especially later in life, she also presented herself as a matriarchal figure, a mother figure to the entire nation, which further cemented the people's affection for her. I'll discuss a few queens of Scotland next. Like England, Scotland has had several queen regents throughout history. The first example of a queen regnant I can find is a woman called Margaret, Maid of Norway. Margaret was born to King Eric II of Norway and King Alexander III of Scotland's daughter Margaret. She was never actually crowned and never set foot in Scotland. However, she was declared heir to the throne and began a voyage to Scotland. However, she actually died on the way, allegedly of seasickness, which for me personally is a terrifying concept. A rather more famous Queen of Scotland was Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots is an extremely well-known figure, but most people know very little about her life. She's a very intriguing character, though not a particularly effective ruler. She was married 3 times, most notably to the King of France. She had a son with her second husband, Lord Darnley, who ultimately became King James VI and I of Scotland and England. Now, it's possible she was behind the murder of her second husband, Lord Darnley. Darnley had himself murdered her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, out of jealousy, as he believed they were having an affair, and that he had in fact impregnated Mary. This has led to speculation that Mary had Darnley murdered, particularly as she then married the alleged perpetrator of her husband's murder, the Earl of Bothwell, only 3 months after his death. This was not a politically astute move and caused an ability to revolt and force her abdication. She then sought protection from her cousin Queen Elizabeth I, who was at that time ruling England, but for political reasons she was imprisoned for 19 years, as it was feared she could potentially claim the throne, which was worrying as she was a Catholic. Spies under the direction of Francis Walsingham seized Mary's letters. As a result, she was implicated in a plot against the Queen's life, who at that point felt forced to sentence her cousin to death, though with great reluctance. For simplicity's sake, I've dealt with Queens of England and Scotland separately. However, from this point on, we can work chronologically with Queens of England, Scotland and Ireland, and then later Queens of Great Britain and Ireland, and then into the United Kingdom. Mary II was Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland. That's Mary II as in William of Mary, William of Orange of course. Mary II was considered a remarkable beauty. She was very tall at 5'11". She was also quite active, and supposedly was the first to popularise the keeping of goldfish in England. Mary II presided over an extremely important period in British history, namely the Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which William and Mary were invited by the brilliantly named Immortal Seven to invade England and overthrow Mary's father, King James II the Tyrant. Mary's amicable personality meant that she'd become very popular in the Netherlands, and she was also popular in Britain due to the fact that she'd married a Protestant. Mary and William were in fact joint rulers, although Mary preferred to allow William to take the lead and generally only ruled during his absence. Now, although this perhaps irks our modern sensitivities, it's perhaps unfair for us to judge her for this. Not everyone can be Lara Croft. It's a long-running bugbear for historians that people often now only look to history to confirm what they already believe. It becomes a kind of mirror for their own prejudices. We may not like that she was a demure and not particularly educated woman. However, she proved a competent ruler when she chose to be, and she was involved in charitable works, notably including the founding of Greenwich Hospital for Disabled Seamen, don't laugh, which was designed by Sir Christopher Wren, and is now the old Royal Naval College, part of the Maritime Greenwich World Heritage Site in London. She also played her part in the establishment by charter of the still operational College of William and Mary in Virginia. In other words, Mary achieved a lot. She's done rather more than I have, that's for sure, and we'd be unfair to judge her based on the standards of our time. Mary sadly suffered a great deal of unhappiness in life due to an inability to have children, and was also troubled greatly by her estrangement from her father. Mary also presided over the 1689 Bill of Rights, which in constitutional terms is of similar magnitude to Magna Carta, and lays the foundations of constitutional monarchy by limiting royal prerogative and demanding government by consent of the people through Parliament, based on the ideas of John Locke, the father of liberalism. The next queen on our list is not particularly well known, and I'm not really sure why. Queen Anne was the last sovereign of the House of Stuart. The most notable event of her reign was the 1707 Act of Union, which merged the kingdoms of England and Scotland to form the Kingdom of Great Britain. Ireland remained a separate kingdom at this point. This created the largest free trade area on the continent and provided the power base behind what would ultimately become the largest empire in history. Anne was sent to France at age 3 for 2 years for the treatment of an eye condition, during which time she learnt fluent French. Anne ended up supporting the Glorious Revolution of her older sister. However, during this time she suffered several miscarriages and lost 2 daughters to smallpox during their infancy. Her son meanwhile survived to age 11. However, his death cast a dark cloud over Anne's reign when she eventually took the throne. Another major event of Anne's reign was the War of Spanish Succession, which lasted 13 years. It's not particularly well known these days, though you've probably at least heard of the Battle of Blenheim. This was a major conflict in Europe, in which a coalition of powers led by England defeated a French coalition only shortly after Anne's death. As a result of the war, Britain gained Gibraltar, Minorca, and what is now the maritime provinces of Canada, as well as French recognition of British control in Newfoundland and vast swathes of northern and central Canada. Anne has often been portrayed as indecisive and easily influenced, yet this ignores the situation of the time. Anne was forced to manage an extremely volatile political environment in Parliament, where modern two-party politics was in the process of emerging. Anne sought to mediate between the two factions, with the Whigs and the Tories, but it was known that she favoured the Tories over the Whigs on religious grounds. Anne actually attended more cabinet meetings than any other monarch before or since, which is perhaps testament to the hands-on nature of her rule. Queen Anne had a close and often toxic friendship with Sarah Churchill from childhood, from whom she received often overbearing advice, which caused increasing tension as they grew older, as Anne gradually became a more formidable personality and more independent-minded. This long-standing relationship ultimately collapsed following the death of Anne's husband, Prince George of Denmark. Victoria was Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and later Empress of India. Queen Victoria clearly needs less promotion than some of the other queens on this list, as she had a whole era named after her. Victoria was the longest reigning monarch in British history until Queen Elizabeth II, and ascended the throne at the age of 18. Victoria was the last of the Hanoverian dynasty. We often have quite a fixed image of Queen Victoria in our minds, the plump, dour older woman declaring to be unamused by everything. However, she was an extremely multifaceted character. Victoria had an extremely strict upbringing, in which she was isolated from her uncle the king and other children. She was at no point ever allowed to be alone. This included sharing a bedroom with her mother until her coronation. This prison-like regime was enforced by her mother and her mother's advisor and possible lover Sir John Conroy, in the hope of controlling Victoria in the event of a regency. For these reasons she was an extremely unhappy child. Victoria ruled for 63 years during the high noon of the British Empire, during which time she was arguably the most powerful person on the planet. Victoria was only 4'11", yet she inspired awe in her subjects with her larger-than-life personality. A good example of this would be her 40-year mourning of her husband Albert. Victoria introduced haemophilia into the royal families of Europe in her capacity of the grandmother of Europe. Her many children were married off to the other great royal dynasties of Europe, partly in the hope of maintaining a peaceful continent. Queen Victoria had some interesting relationship with her prime ministers. Early in her reign she famously adored Lord Melbourne, and this was a source of minor political scandal, as the young queen was clearly failing to be impartial. Later in her reign, of course, Disraeli, who showered the old queen in flattery, calling her a fairy queen, and at one point supposedly imitated the famous Walter Raleigh coat incident, in which Sir Walter gallantly laid down his coat to cover a puddle so that Queen Elizabeth I would not have to suffer the indignity of damp shoes. Victoria adored the outrageous flattery of this eccentric fop and became extremely attached. She famously hated Disraeli's great rival, the Liberal leader Gladstone, but she didn't care much either for Lord Russell, or even Palmerston either. Disraeli later gave his beloved queen a promotion to Empress of India, which is a position she took extremely seriously. She brought over several Indian servants into her household and learned Hindi and Urdu so that she could better understand her subjects and their culture, which perhaps jars with our modern perception of Victoria. Incidentally, Victoria was also fluent in English and German, and spoke Latin, Italian and French also. Another servant, however, became a subject of wild speculation in her later years. Her Scottish servant, John Brown, provided her with companionship in her old age, and some have suggested they even had a secret marriage. Unfortunately, we don't know for sure. A fictionalised representation of their relationship was presented in the film Mrs. Brown, starring Billy Connolly and Dame Judi Dench. Queen Victoria was one of our most influential monarchs, and I think would also be top 5, like Queen Elizabeth. It's not outrageous to put in the company of, for example, Alfred the Great or Henry VIII in terms of their influence on their people and their times they lived in. Incidentally, you win nothing if you correctly guess the final queen on our list. Elizabeth II is Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The Queen is the longest reigning monarch in British history and has kept the monarchy alive and popular into the 21st century, which is particularly impressive in the wake of the Republican sentiments that emerged following the death of Princess Diana. The Queen has striven to maintain links with the Commonwealth throughout and following the process of decolonisation that characterised her reign. Elizabeth is still Queen of 16 Commonwealth realms beside the United Kingdom, most notably including Canada, Australia and New Zealand, the Old Dominions. Personally, I love the Queen. She's an elegant granny from a more civilised age. Personally, I think she'll be most remembered for her work towards peace in Northern Ireland and her visit to Ireland, which was perhaps an important part of the healing process after a troubled relationship between Great Britain and Ireland over the last 1,000 years. I think this is particularly impressive in light of the trauma she suffered by the murder of her cousin Lord Mountbatten by the IRA during the Troubles. Elizabeth, of course, is the embodiment of a constitutional monarchy, and in that sense it could be argued that in tangible terms she's achieved virtually nothing compared to some of the other queens on this list. She, of course, chooses to remain aloof from politics completely. However, she's taken on importance in terms of a figurehead of the nation, and as a kind of symbol with continuity with the past. The Queen is kind of a fascinating figure. It's strange that this tiny old lady, this kind of strange Yoda-like figure, somehow embodies the prestige and history of monarchy, and has powerful figures like American presidents cowering in fear. It's bizarre, they have no idea how to react to her. Although in one sense you may see the monarchy as something of a relic of a bygone age, it's almost become so incongruous that it's somehow become a vital aspect of Britain's soft power. So that concludes what was intended to be a comprehensive list of Britain and Ireland's ruling queens. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed it.